outside is very attractive. Please let me remind you once again that for tonight's dinner, those of you who want to join the walking tour, they should meet outside the Palace Hotel at 7:15, 7:15, and there will be guides for the walking tour. I think the rest of you would want to find their own way, should be in the place by 8:30 or so, okay? But now let me introduce our next plenary speaker, Andrew McCoshan, who will present a big study on cross-border education, and the topic of his presentation is franchising validation and branch campuses in the European Union or of the European Union. I don't know, we'll see. Okay? Andrew, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, I almost put in Europe in the title, but I thought that might be slightly inaccurate as well. But that's one of those issues, isn't it? Thank you very much for inviting me to present the results of this study. As was mentioned, it was commissioned by the European Commission over a year ago, and in fact we started on it around about this time last year. Most of the data collection was over the summer period, and we did some further case study work in the autumn. So we were drafting in the first few months of this year, and it should be available in June. That's the latest I have from the Commission itself. So what were the aims of the study? Broadly speaking, and in simple terms, there were three aims. The first of these was to map the state of play in the scale and types of, I'll call it CBHE. As you saw in the title, it's actually franchising, validation and branch campuses, which of course is a narrower definition, but I think my presentation would take quite a long time if every time I had to talk about CBHE, I had to say franchising, validation and branch campuses instead. So if you'll excuse me, I'll refer to CBHE. The second aim was to look at what are called here regulatory mechanisms, essentially the way in which countries within the EU may or may not seek to control the operation of foreign providers on their territories. And finally, to gather the views of stakeholders on the risks and benefits of CBHE and on quality issues. I should say that the study was undertaken by through a framework contract which is led by the Bertelsmann Foundation and was undertaken mainly by a German consultancy which you may have heard of called CHE Consult, and I was employed as a researcher on that in light of previous experience I have conducting studies for the European Commission. What method did we use? A combination of methods. We used what's called an experts Delphi method to try and engage some stakeholders at the beginning to get their views, to shape the topics to be covered in the work, and also participate in shaping the questionnaires which were used for the main data collection tool, which was a survey across 27 member states of mainly ministries, quality assurance bodies and providers. And naturally there's a caveat therefore on the data that we were able to collect. As you can imagine, it's a hugely difficult task to try and map this type of activity across Europe. But I think what we've been able to produce is some interesting maps and insights into the current state of play. Along with that survey, we also conducted some in-depth interviews in 4 countries: Austria, Cyprus, France, and the UK. I'll move on to the substantive part of the findings. I'll look first at the map of the current state of play, looking first at which institutions, the pattern of exports across Europe on a country-by-country basis, then look at the importing side of things, bring those together before moving on to regulatory aspects. I hope this doesn't turn into death by maps. I am a geographer originally, so I apologise for the fact that there are quite a large number of maps here, but I think it's quite a nice way of presenting the data that we've actually been able to gather. So what the pattern of exports that we found on a... Oops, beg your pardon. Yes, sorry. In terms of the initial overview, well, perhaps not surprisingly, the picture is quite scattered and fragmented. And of course, this type of activity affects only a very small percentage of students. It's worth bearing that in mind at the start. Here we're talking about franchising, validation and branch campuses within Europe, so not from outside into Europe, but actually within Europe itself. Doesn't mean it's not important for the students involved, but it's worth taking that into account. It's almost as if these activities within Europe itself are at quite an early stage of development. Of course, the patterns are the product of thousands of individual decisions by faculty and institutions themselves, and therefore generalisations are notoriously difficult. I hope these maps will work. The auditorium's a little bit bigger than I thought it was going to be, but I think the broad trends come out quite well from looking at this in the interval. These are global exports. Well, they're actually what people in the EU told us about where exports were coming from, and perhaps no surprises there in terms of the countries outside Europe that are active in exporting CBHE activities. We can move on to look in more detail at CBHE exports within the EU itself. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that the number of incidents is not particularly large that we found in this case, and you won't be able to read the scale at the bottom, but the scale the lightest green is below 2 incidences of activity, and the darkest colour is 8 plus levels of activity. So, of course, the differences between the countries on here are quite small. But it does bring out I think two key things. The first is, perhaps not surprisingly, the ubiquity of CBHE within the UK. There are institutions in every region of the UK which do franchising, validation, or branch campuses in one form or another. And the other interesting fact is that it is, in fact, quite widespread across Europe. We don't have any data of trends over time, but given the fact that this is an increasing trend, one can imagine this picture developing over time, and more regions on the map being filled in. What can we talk about CBHE being received, if you like, imported CBHE or incoming CBHE? Here again, I should say right at the start that the differences between countries are not substantial. The lightest blue is below 2 incidences of activity, whereas the dark blue is 20 plus. But you can see that CBHE received is most common perhaps in the south and west, especially in Spain and Greece, and least common in the north and east of Europe. The bars on the map represent the types of activity in terms of branch campuses being in orange here, or the reddy orange colour, and the franchising and validation shown as yellow. It was very difficult for us to reliably differentiate between franchising and validation, owing to the quality of information we were able to get from respondents, and that's something I'll return to later on in terms of the level of data that's actually available. I think mapping this at on a sort of country geographical scale is slightly misleading, and you can put the same data onto a map of regions, and it looks like this. And this probably gives a better idea of the sort of scattered nature of this type of CBHE. Perhaps not surprisingly, on here you can see that capital cities are quite popular. What happens if we compare exporting and receiving CBHE? In other words, we overlay the two on the top. The blue here is the received CBHE, and the green triangles are the exports. Well, it's a very mixed pattern. Some countries, some regions do both, like parts of the UK. Others, like Greece, for example, and Cyprus, are receivers of CBHE. So it is, as you would probably expect, quite a mixed picture. The other question we can ask is what type of institutions export, and that's shown on the next map. Now, the underlying colours are is that previous map you've seen on exports. The circles are divided according to whether we're talking about private or public institutions. Private institutions are shown in yellow, and the public ones in red. Looking at that for a while, you can see that there's a sort of 50-50 split between public and private provision across Europe. Variations between countries may be due to regulations in those countries in terms of differences between public and private sector in terms of the way they can operate. The other thing that's of interest is that publicly funded institutions tend to do validation and franchising activities, whilst private institutions are more likely to be involved in branch campuses. I think that probably reflects differences in the value attached to different forms of provision from the public and the private sector, and also the different calculus for private providers in terms of investment in branch campuses. We can also look at the same split between public and private in terms of which types of institutions receive. And in contrast to exports, the overwhelming colour here is yellow for the private sector. They're the ones who mainly in receipt of franchising, validation and branch campuses. Though, as you can see, there are exceptions in particular countries, notably Lithuania on there, for example. We can also tell you what type of degrees are most popular from this sample that we have. And in most countries, it's bachelor's degrees that dominate. They're shown here in yellow. But the orange and the red, which is hard to pick up, represent masters and doctorates respectively. So the orange is masters programs and the red is doctorates. And as you can see, they're pretty significant too in the overall scheme of things. As well as this sort of empirical mapping from our sample, we were able to look at the issue of whether countries that were in receipt of these forms of CBHE tend to be the ones that have the largest numbers of students going abroad. I suppose the theory behind this being that students might be voting with their feet and seeking provision elsewhere because they can't find it at home. And interestingly, while you can't tell it from this map, that we actually did find a statistical relationship between the outflow of students and the incidence of incoming cross-border higher education in these forms. I should highlight a notable exception being here in Spain, which is Spain, that sort of bucks this trend. And it is speculation as to why that might be, but a lot of the provision of business courses and in English, which may reflect a preference by students. We did some thinking around the issue of potential explanatory factors in all this, and of course, flowing from the last map, our list starts with students' perceptions of quality and/or quality of provision in their own countries. More generally, it may be that CBHE fills gaps where there may be general issues of modernisation in certain countries' higher education systems. That doesn't explain provision across Europe in all countries, of course. And of course, there are niche gaps as well where student demand may exceed supply, or whether there just isn't current provision, so foreign providers can provide it. Another factor is that the need to charge fees may be important where domestic provision is free to the student, given the importance of private provision in this. Fees will be an important issue, and of course in countries where domestic provision is free, the equation for students is very different to where they actually already pay fees. A few things to note in this is that, of course, receiving institutions are not just passive recipients in this process, and exporters pursuing high-quality long-term relationships, like those we heard about from Nottingham, pursue partnerships with their own with organisations in other countries. And I think I make those remarks simply because in some of the case study discussions, it's easy to pick up a feeling that actually rogue diploma mills and so on, and rogue providers are in danger of tarring everybody with the same brush. I'll say more about that in a minute. Of course, the key thing to remember is that each country has its own pattern of incoming and outgoing CBHE, and that will be shaped by a unique combination of factors. That's our findings on the empirical side in terms of mapping. I now turn to, if I can go the right way. Yep. I now turn to the question of regulation, or the ways in which countries seek to control imports of cross-border higher education. And here we, in the process of gathering data, we had regards to existing typologies in this area, particularly one by Verbeek and Jokivirta from 2005. There was a bit of an iterative process in terms of starting with that typology and then gathering our data and seeing whether it was applicable to Europe. That was a global typology, if I recall rightly. In this typology, there are four levels, if you like, of progressive regulation, from the top one here, minimal or no restrictions on foreign providers' freedom to operate, through to foreign providers being required to obtain accreditation in the receiving countries. It was easier to define the ends of this continuum rather than the two categories in the middle. Of course, when you start putting countries into categories, it gets very difficult, and it's better to conceive of this as a set of going from whites to black, really, and a set of greys in the middle, rather than hard and fast divisions. In terms of the first category there, I'll just run through these. While there's minimal or no restrictions on providers' freedom to operate, there is the indirect but important influence of recognition of degrees within countries, and of course that's very important. In many of these countries, it's not possible for foreign providers to have their degrees recognised, or the process of getting them recognised is quite long-winded and difficult for them. The second level down here is that foreign providers may be required to register and or have sending country accreditation. That may be simply a question of sending forms in. The third one here is that it's a slightly more, it's a different form of registration and or requirement for consent to be required from the home authorities. And at the bottom here we have the situation where foreign providers are effectively required to become part of the national system. And also in some countries there are some bans, for example on branch campuses in Latvia. In some of these countries, additional requirements are placed upon foreign providers. For example, in Poland, it's necessary for foreign providers to be accredited at home by a QA body, which is on the register that we heard about earlier. So what does the map look like if we categorise our countries according to this typology? Again, impossible for you to read the key at the bottom, but logically we go from the lightest colour of minimal, no regulation restrictions, to the darkest colour where foreign providers are required to obtain accreditation in the receiving countries. We coloured Germany in here as one colour, I should mention, but of course you could show a map of the lender on here and there might be differences between them, but we thought it best to err on this side of things in the case of Germany. Now, an interesting question, of course, is does this pattern have a perceptible effect on incoming CBHE? And in short, the answer is no. Again, you can't see it from this map, but the triangles represent the incidences of received activity. Remember, of course, that the numbers are small, and also we can't demonstrate the counterfactual. If the countries in the dark colours were to remove their regulations, we don't know whether there'd be an influx of foreign provision or not. Other things we can say about regulation is that knowledge amongst stakeholders, in this case largely ministries and quality assurance bodies, is highly variable of the level of CBHE in terms of the data sets held, and also the effects of it, and also of regulatory frameworks. Indeed, it can be difficult to find someone in a country who actually can give you a very comprehensive answer about regulatory frameworks, and that probably reflects in part the fact that it's not a very common feature of the landscape at the moment, franchising, validation of branch campuses for certain countries. Interestingly, more regulations tended to be desired in some countries, even though regulations are already quite significant. And that led us to think whether, in a sense, current regulatory frameworks are a sort of insurance against future risk, or insurance that is the result of current perceptions rather than the reality. Turning to issues of quality, as you can see from, as you might have picked up from the previous slides about the regulatory frameworks, there's a common reliance on accreditation processes of sending countries. About 2/3 of countries, in some form, rely upon the accreditation of the institution in their home country for some sort of guarantee of quality, if you like. So there's a sort of high level of trust already exists in the system. But interestingly, hardly any country has in place mechanisms to ensure the quality of exports, even when there's a strong regulation of the incoming CBHE. And from a European dimension, it's interesting that only 3 countries differentiate between EU and non-EU provision. We also asked our respondents if they could comment on, give us their perceptions on the risks and benefits related to quality. And our sample size was small here, so I haven't gone into detail, but I guess in a sense these are responses you might expect. Ministries and quality assurance bodies were rather neutral with regard to risks and benefits compared to other respondents. Providers tended to perceive fewer risks and more benefits, and rectors, conferences and umbrella bodies tended to see fewer benefits as well. As I say, the data set there is very small, so we haven't gone into that in a lot of depth. Finally, on quality, drawing on the work from our in-depth country interviews in particular, it's clear that in the absence of evidence, perceptions and misperceptions can dominate. And, of course, in some countries, it can become a very hot topic indeed, the nature of franchising and validation arrangements. At the same time, we found that there's a lack of information for students on quality on providers' websites. That's whether we're talking about the provider, the institution they're attending, or in terms of the provider who's franchising or validating the course that they're actually taking. Not surprisingly, as we already heard and we already know, there's variations between countries in their QA procedures. But cooperation between countries is underdeveloped. We asked QA bodies to comment on the extent to which they had reached agreements with other QA bodies in other member states, and that's shown in the blobs on yellow on here, and the orange reflects no agreement. And as you can see here, there's clearly scope to develop cross-border arrangements between quality assurance agencies. The blue represents the responses to a question related to whether membership in the European Quality Assurance Register helps with building of trust. And the lightest blue is do not agree, and the darkest blue is fully agree. So there's clearly, amongst those agencies that responded to this, there's clearly some support for the notion that the register would be useful in that regard. Finally, to return to my last slide, the last point here is the issue of at what level accreditation ought actually to take place, whether at institutional or programme level. And we didn't gather much data on this question, but clearly it's very important. For example, the QAA focus on institutional level accreditation stands in contrast to views in other countries where the need to accredit individual programmes is seen as really important. So what can we conclude overall? I think one of the main headlines here is that there's a need for much more substantial evidence in terms of the level of these forms of CBHE and their effects in policy making itself. There's also clearly scope to develop the relationships between QA bodies in Europe, and also in terms of the role of potential coordinating bodies and policies and so on. At the institutional level, of course, there's a need for quality mechanisms on both sides of the sender-receiver relationship. In our in-depth interviews, we picked up some very useful insights into the nature of that relationship, and how some providers who were receiving these forms of CBHE often benefited from the quality assurance procedures of the provider themselves. So I hope that's given you a good overview of our work, and I hope it provides some food for thought. Happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew.